The smell of motor oil and the sound of metal clanging filled the small repair shop on Elm Street every morning at 6. While most 15-year-old girls were still sleeping, Maya Rodriguez was already wiping down tools and organizing parts in her father's garage. This wasn't punishment or some kind of summer job. This was where she wanted to be. Maya's father, Carlos, had owned Rodriguez Auto Repair for 23 years. He'd started with nothing but a toolbox and a dream, working out of a rented garage barely big enough for one car. Now his shop could handle 4 vehicles at once, and people drove from 3 towns over just to have Carlos take a look at their engines. Carlos had a secret weapon that most customers never knew about. His daughter Maya had been watching, learning and understanding cars since she could barely walk. While other toddlers played with dolls, Maya was fascinated by the way her father's hands moved under the hood of a car. She would sit quietly on an old milk crate, her dark eyes following every movement as Carlos diagnosed problems that had stumped other mechanics. By the time Maya turned 8, she could hand her father the right tool before he even asked for it. She knew the difference between a Phillips head screwdriver and a flathead, could spot a worn brake pad from 20 feet away, and understood that different engine sounds meant different problems. When a car came in making a weird noise, Maya would tilt her head and listen like she was hearing a conversation that only she could understand. The other kids at school thought Maya was strange. While they talked about movies and video games, Maya got excited about carburetors and transmission fluid. Her teacher, Mrs. Peterson, constantly tried to redirect Maya's interests toward what she called more appropriate activities for young ladies. During career day, when Maya announced she wanted to be a mechanic like her father, Mrs. Peterson suggested she consider being a teacher or a nurse instead. Maya's mother, Rosa, loved her daughter deeply but worried about her future. Rosa worked as a secretary at the town's medical clinic and had dreams of Maya becoming a doctor or maybe a lawyer. She would often say, "Mia, you're so smart. You could do anything. Why do you want to work with your hands all dirty when you could work in a nice clean office?" But Maya didn't want a clean office. She wanted to understand why engines worked, why they sometimes didn't work, and how to make them purr like happy cats again. To her, every car that rolled into the shop was like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Some puzzles were easy, a loose belt here, low oil there. Others were mysteries that kept her awake at night, thinking about all the possible solutions. Carlos saw something special in his daughter that reminded him of himself when he was young. He remembered being Maya's age and feeling like he could communicate with machines in a way that other people couldn't. So while Rosa worried and teachers disapproved, Carlos quietly taught Maya everything he knew. "Listen, Mia," he would say, placing his hand on a running engine. "Every engine has its own voice. This one is happy. Hear how smooth it sounds. But yesterday, the blue truck was crying. It was telling us the timing belt was getting ready to break." Maya learned that cars weren't just machines. They were almost alive. They had moods and personalities. The old pickup trucks were usually straightforward and honest about their problems. The fancy sports cars could be dramatic and temperamental. The family minivans were tired but reliable, just trying to do their job day after day. Word spread around town about Carlos's daughter, who seemed to know as much about cars as some grown men. But not everyone was impressed. When Maya was 12, a customer named Bill Thompson brought in his truck and specifically asked that the little girl not touch it. He said he didn't want some kid messing around with his expensive vehicle. Carlos politely explained that Maya only observed and learned, but Thompson shook his head. "Keep her away from my truck," he said firmly. Maya pretended it didn't hurt, but it did. She began to notice how some customers would look surprised or uncomfortable when they saw her in the shop. A few would ask Carlos if he had any sons, as if having a daughter who understood engines was somehow disappointing. The worst part was when other mechanics came to visit Carlos. They would talk shop, discussing complex engine problems and sharing stories about difficult repairs. Maya would listen from her corner, often knowing the solutions they were struggling with. But whenever she tried to contribute to the conversation, the adult mechanics would smile politely and change the subject. It was like she was invisible. Or worse, like her ideas didn't matter because of her age and gender. At school, things weren't much better. The boys in her class assumed she didn't know anything about guy stuff like cars. The girls thought she was weird for preferring the garage to the mall. Maya found herself caught between two worlds, not quite fitting into either one. But every afternoon when school ended, Maya would walk the 6 blocks to her father's shop, and everything would make sense again. She would change into her work clothes, old jeans and a t-shirt that already had grease stains, and become herself again. Carlos would update her on the day's challenges, and Maya would offer her thoughts on each case. One particularly busy Thursday, Carlos was stumped by a customer's sedan that kept stalling for no apparent reason. He'd checked the fuel system, the electrical system, and the engine timing. Everything looked perfect on paper, but the car would run fine for 10 minutes, and then suddenly die. Maya had been watching from her usual spot, and finally she approached her father. "Dad, what if it's overheating in a place we can't see? Like maybe the coolant isn't flowing right through the radiator." Carlos paused and looked at his daughter with new respect. He hadn't checked the radiator thoroughly because the temperature gauge showed everything was normal. But Maya was right. There could be a partial blockage, causing localized overheating that wouldn't show up on the dashboard. 20 minutes later, Carlos found the problem exactly where Maya had suggested. A buildup of debris was blocking part of the radiator, causing the engine to overheat just enough to stall, but not enough to trigger the warning systems. That night at dinner, Carlos told Rosa about Maya's diagnosis. "She saw something I missed," he said proudly. "She's got the gift." Rosa smiled but still worried. "The gift is wonderful, Carlos, but what kind of life will she have? People don't take women mechanics seriously. She struggled her whole career." Maya listened to her parents discuss her future like she wasn't even there. She understood their concerns, but she also knew something they didn't quite grasp yet. She wasn't just good at fixing cars, she was exceptional. And exceptional people, Maya believed, eventually proved themselves no matter what obstacles they faced. As Maya got older, the challenges didn't disappear, but her confidence grew stronger. She started reading every automotive manual she could find, watching repair videos online, and even corresponding with mechanics in other states through internet forums. Nobody online knew she was a teenage girl, so her advice was judged purely on its merit. And her advice was consistently good. Day Maya turned 15, Carlos gave her a toolbox of her own, a beautiful red toolbox with her name engraved on the front. "Every real mechanic needs her own tools," he said. Maya ran her fingers over the engraving and made a silent promise to herself. Someday, people would stop seeing her as the mechanic's daughter and start seeing her as a mechanic in her own right. Someday, her gender and age wouldn't matter more than her skill and knowledge. She had no idea. That day was coming sooner than she thought. The bright yellow flyer appeared on every storefront window in town the same Tuesday morning. Maya first saw it taped to the door of Miller's hardware store on her way to school. The bold letters at the top caught her attention immediately. Annual County Fair Auto Challenge, $5,000 reward. Maya stopped walking and read the entire flyer twice. The challenge was simple in concept, but apparently impossible in execution. Someone would need to fix a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback that had been declared unfixable by every professional mechanic who had tried. The car belonged to Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman whose late husband had babied that Mustang for 40 years. Before his passing 3 years ago, according to the flyer, the car had been running perfectly until about 6 months after Mr. Chun died. Then it simply stopped starting one day and never ran again. Mrs. Chun had taken it to every garage in the county, including the big dealership in the next town over. Master mechanics had spent hundreds of hours trying to bring it back to life. Nothing worked. The fair committee had decided to turn the mystery into the main attraction for this year's automotive competition. Any licensed mechanic could enter, and whoever got the car running would win $5,000, plus the glory of solving what people were calling the impossible puzzle. Maya's heart started beating faster as she read the rules. You had to be 18 or older to officially enter, but the flyer mentioned that assistants were allowed. She folded the paper carefully and stuffed it into her backpack, her mind already racing with possibilities. At school that day, Maya couldn't concentrate on anything else. During math class, she found herself sketching engine diagrams in her notebook margins. During English, she was thinking about fuel systems and electrical problems instead of the assigned reading. Her teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, no relation despite the shared last name, had to call her name 3 times before she looked up from her daydreaming. Maya, perhaps you'd like to share what's so fascinating in your notebook that it's more important than our discussion of symbolism in literature. Maya's cheeks burned red as her classmates turned to stare at her. Sorry, Mr. Rodriguez, I was just ... thinking about something else. Well, please save your other thoughts for after class. This material will be on next week's test. Maya nodded and tried to focus, but her mind kept drifting back to that Mustang. What kind of problem could stump so many experienced mechanics? It had to be something unusual, something that didn't show up in standard diagnostic tests. When the final bell rang, Maya practically ran to her father's shop. She burst through the door, still wearing her school backpack, and found Carlos underneath a Honda Civic. Dad, did you see the flyer about the car challenge at the county fair? Carlos rolled out from under the car, wiping his hands on a rag. You mean Mrs. Chun's Mustang? Yeah, I heard about it. Poor woman has probably spent more money trying to fix that car than it's worth at this point. Have you looked at it? Carlos shook his head. Mrs. Chun asked me to take a look about 2 years ago, but I was backed up with work for 3 weeks. By the time I could get to it, she'd already taken it to Johnson's Automotive. Then when Johnson couldn't fix it, she took it to that fancy place in Riverside. After that, she kind of gave up calling around. Maya felt a spark of excitement. So, you've never actually seen the car? Nope, but I heard it's been to at least 6 different shops. If Tommy Johnson can't fix it, and those certified guys at the dealership can't fix it, I'm not sure what I could do different. That evening, at dinner, Maya couldn't stop talking about the challenge. She peppered her father with questions about different types of engine problems and their symptoms. Carlos answered patiently, but Maya could see he was curious too. You know, Rosa said, setting down her fork, Mrs. Chun goes to the same church as your Aunt Maria. Maria mentioned that Mrs. Chun cries every time she sees that car sitting in her driveway. It reminds her of her husband, but she can't bear to sell it because he loved it so much. Maya felt a pang of sadness for the elderly woman. This wasn't just about a broken car. It was about memories and love and loss. Suddenly, the $5,000 prize seemed less important than helping someone who was hurting. The next day after school, Maya convinced her father to drive by Mrs. Chun's house. The Mustang sat in the driveway like a beautiful red sculpture, its paint still gleaming, despite 3 years of sitting unused. Even from the street, Maya could see it was a gorgeous car, the kind that turned heads when it drove by. It's beautiful, Maya whispered. Your grandfather had one just like it, Carlos said quietly. Same year, same color. He used to let me help him wash it every Sunday after church. They sat in their truck for a few minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Carlos started the engine. Come on, Mia. We should get home. But Maya couldn't stop thinking about that Mustang. She started researching 1967 Mustangs online, reading about common problems and unusual issues. She learned about the differences between the various engine options, the electrical systems, and the mechanical quirks that were specific to that model year. 1 week before the county fair, Maya made a decision that surprised even herself. She walked into the kitchen where her parents were having their morning coffee and announced, "I want to enter the car challenge." Rosa nearly choked on her coffee. "Maya, you're not old enough to enter. I can be Dad's assistant. The rules allow." Assistance. Carlos looked at his daughter seriously. "Maya, this isn't like the cars that come into our shop. This is a car that has stumped some very good mechanics. People are going to be watching, and if we can't fix it, then we'll be in the same boat as everyone else who tried," Maya finished. "But what if we can fix it?" Carlos was quiet for a long moment. Maya could see him weighing the risks. His reputation was solid in their small town, but failing publicly at the county fair would be embarrassing. On the other hand, he'd taught Maya everything he knew, and she'd already proven she could see things he sometimes missed. "The competition is in 5 days," Carlos said slowly. "We'd need to register by tomorrow. So we have tonight to decide," Maya said, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. That evening, the Rodriguez family had the longest dinner conversation they'd had in months. Rosa worried about Maya getting her hopes up and being disappointed. Carlos worried about damaging his professional reputation. Maya worried about Mrs. Chun's Mustang sitting in that driveway forever, never running again. Finally, Carlos made the decision. "Okay, Mia, we'll register tomorrow. But I want you to understand something. This isn't just about fixing the car anymore. Half the county is going to be watching. People are going to expect us to fail because you're young. Well, because you're not what they expect a mechanic to look like." Maya nodded solemnly. "I understand, Dad." But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Maya felt more excited than nervous. She'd been preparing for this moment her whole life, even if she hadn't known it. Every hour spent in the garage, every engine sound she'd learned to interpret, every problem she'd helped solve. It had all led to this out in 5 days. She would stand in front of a crowd of people who didn't believe in her, facing a car that had defeated everyone else who'd tried to fix it. The smart thing would probably be to stay home and avoid the public failure that seemed almost inevitable. But Maya had never been interested in doing the smart thing. She was interested in doing the right thing and helping Mrs. Chun get her husband's car running again felt like exactly the right thing to do. The Mustang was waiting for her. In 5 days, she'd find out if she was ready for it. The morning of the county fair dawned gray and muggy, with thick clouds promising rain before the day was over. Maya had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as her mind ran through every possible engine problem she could think. Oof. She'd gotten up at 5:30 and spent an hour organizing her father's tools, checking and double-checking that everything was clean and ready. By 8 o'clock, pickup trucks and cars were already filling the fairground parking lot. Maya could see people walking toward the automotive section, many carrying folding chairs and coolers like they were settling in for a long show. Word had spread far beyond their small town. People were driving in from 3 counties over to watch the Impossible Car Challenge. Carlos parked their truck near the mechanics area and turned off the engine. He sat quietly for a moment, his hands still on the steering wheel, before looking at his daughter. "You sure about this, Mia? Once we walk over there, there's no turning back. Everyone's going to be watching." Maya nodded, though her stomach felt like it was full of butterflies doing somersaults. "I'm sure, Dad." They grabbed their toolbox from the truck bed and walked toward the crowd. Maya could already see Mrs. Chun's red Mustang sitting in the center of a roped-off area, surrounded by people pointing and talking. The car looked even more beautiful in the morning light, but Maya could see the thin layer of dust on the windshield. That came from sitting unused for so long. The first person to notice them approaching was Tommy Johnson, who owned the biggest garage in town. Tommy was a decent mechanic. Maya's father had always said so. but he had a reputation for being loud and somewhat arrogant. He was talking to a group of other mechanics when he spotted Maya and Carlos. "Well, look who decided to show up," Tommy called out, his voice carrying across the crowd. Carlos Rodriguez and his little helper. Several people turned to look at them, and Maya felt her cheek start to burn. She kept walking, her toolbox feeling heavier with each step. The fair organizer, a cheerful man named Pete Williams, approached them with a clipboard. "Carlos, glad you could make it. We've got 8 mechanics registered for the challenge. Should be quite a show." Maya looked around at the other competitors. She recognized most of them. They were all established mechanics from the area, some with decades of experience. A few she didn't know, but they wore shirts with shop logos from bigger towns. Everyone was older than her father, and they were all men. "So this is your assistant?" Pete asked, glancing at Maya with a friendly smile. "This is my daughter, Maya," Carlos said proudly. "She knows more about engines than most people twice her age." Pete nodded politely, but Maya could see the doubt in his eyes. She'd seen that look before, adults who thought it was cute that she was interested in cars, but didn't really believe she knew what she was doing. As more people gathered around the Mustang, Maya started to feel the weight of their stares. Some looked curious, others skeptical. A few were openly dismissive. She heard whispered conversations floating around her. "Isn't that Carlos's daughter? What's she doing here? Poor kid's going to be embarrassed when she can't fix it. This is supposed to be a serious competition, not bring your daughter to work day." The comments stung, but Maya tried to ignore them. She focused instead on the car, studying it from every angle she could see. The hood was still closed, but she could already tell this was going to be different from working in her father's quiet garage. Around 10 o'clock, Bill Cranston arrived. Bill owned the largest car dealership in the county and sponsored half the events at the fair. He was a big man with a loud voice and an opinion about everything. Maya had met him a few times when he'd brought cars to her father's shop for work. His own mechanics couldn't handle Carlos. Bill boomed, walking over with his hand extended. "Didn't expect to see you here. Thought you were too smart to waste your time on this impossible puzzle." Carlos shook Bill's hand. "Figured we'd take a look. You never know." Bill's eyes shifted to Maya, and his expression changed. "You brought your kid to watch? That's nice. Always good to expose children to different trades, even if they'll never actually work in them." "Maya's not just watching," Carlos said quietly. "She's my assistant." Bill's laugh was loud enough that several people nearby turned to look. "Your assistant?" "Carlos, this is a serious competition. We've got certified master mechanics here, guys with decades of experience. This car has stumped everyone who's touched it. You really think?" He trailed off, looking at Maya like she was a particularly interesting bug. "How old are you, sweetheart?" 15, Maya answered, lifting her chin slightly. 15, Bill laughed again. "And you think you can fix a car that's defeated grown men with college degrees and professional certifications?" Maya felt her father tense beside her, but she spoke before he could say anything. "I think I can try, Mr. Cranston. That's what we're here for." "Well, isn't that precious?" Bill said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Tell you what, little lady. When you can't get it running, and you won't, you come find me. I'll give you a job washing cars at my dealership. That's more your speed." Maya's hands clenched into fists, but she kept her voice steady. "Thank you for the offer, but I don't think I'll need it." Bill walked away, chuckling and shaking his head. Maya heard him talking to another group of mechanics. "Can you believe Carlos brought his teenage daughter to compete? I almost feel bad for the kid. She's going to learn a hard lesson about staying in her lane." By 11 o'clock, the crowd had grown to over 200 people. Maya saw families with children, teenagers from her school, and what looked like half the adult population of 3 towns. Someone had even set up a betting booth, taking odds on which mechanic would solve the problem first. Maya noticed her name wasn't even listed as an option. The rules were explained by Pete Williams using a megaphone. Each mechanic would have 30 minutes to examine the car and diagnose the problem. Then they have 2 hours to attempt the repair. Only basic hand tools were allowed. No fancy computer diagnostic equipment. The first person to get the engine running and keep it running for 5 minutes would win. Maya's hands were trembling now, but not from fear. She was excited. For the first time in her life, she was going to get the chance to prove what she could really do. All these people who thought she was just a kid playing with cars were about to see what her father had been teaching her all these years. Carlos put his hand on her shoulder. "Remember what I always tell you, Mia. Every engine has a story. All you have to do is listen." Maya nodded, taking a deep breath. The first mechanic was already approaching the Mustang to begin his examination. In a few hours, she'd have her chance. Around her, the crowd continued to grow and the noise level increased. People were treating this like entertainment, like a show put on for their amusement. Maya realized that for most of these people, she was the sideshow, the amusing distraction before the real mechanics got to work. Tommy Johnson was holding court near the concession stand, explaining to anyone who'd listen why the car couldn't be fixed. "I spent 6 hours on that engine," he was saying. "Pulled half of it apart. The problem isn't mechanical, it's electrical. But the electrical system checks out fine. It's like the car just decided to give up." Another mechanic nodded knowingly. "Some cars are like that. They get old. They get tired. Sometimes there's nothing you can do." Maya listened to the conversation and felt a surge of determination. These men were talking about the Mustang like it was already dead, like it was hopeless. But Maya didn't believe in hopeless cars. She believed that every car wanted to run, and if you listened carefully enough, it would tell you what it needed. Mrs. Chun arrived around noon, walking slowly with a cane and wearing a black dress that made her look even more fragile than she was. Maya watched as several people approached the elderly woman to offer their condolences and explain why her husband's car probably couldn't be saved. But Maya saw something different in Mrs. Chun's eyes when she looked at the Mustang. It wasn't just sadness, it was hope. Despite everything, despite all the failed attempts and expert opinions, Mrs. Chun still believed her husband's car could run again. That hope was worth more than any prize money. Maya was going to do everything in her power to make sure Mrs. Chun didn't leave the fair disappointed. The first mechanic finished his examination and shook his head. The second one lasted longer but came to the same conclusion. By 2 o'clock, 5 mechanics had tried and failed. Maya's turn was coming soon. The crowd was getting restless, the betting odds were shifting, and she could feel hundreds of eyes getting ready to focus on her dot. It was almost time to show everyone what the mechanics' daughter could really do. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 6 mechanics had tried and failed to bring Mrs. Chun's Mustang back to life. The crowd was getting restless, and Maya could hear people starting to talk about heading home early. Some folks were already packing up their folding chairs, convinced that the impossible car was going to stay impossible. Pete Williams called out through his megaphone, "Next up, we have Carlos Rodriguez from Rodriguez Auto Repair, assisted by his daughter Maya." The crowd's energy shifted slightly. Some people who had been walking away turned back, curious to see what would happen next. Maya heard a few scattered comments as she and her father approached the Mustang. "Oh, this should be interesting. Poor kid doesn't know what she's getting into. At least it'll be quick." Maya's hands were steady now, which surprised her. All morning she'd been nervous, but now that it was actually time to work, she felt calm. This was what she'd been training for her entire life, even if she hadn't realized it until now. Carlos popped the hood of the Mustang, and Maya got her first real look at the engine. It was beautiful. Mr. Chun had obviously taken incredible care of this car. The engine bay was cleaner than most modern cars. and every component looked like it had been maintained with love and attention. 30 minutes for examination starts now, Pete announced. Maya stepped closer to the engine, aware that dozens of people were watching her every move. She could feel cameras pointed at her. Apparently someone was recording the whole event for the local news. But she tried to block out the distractions and focus on what her father had taught her. "Talk to me," she whispered to the engine, too quietly for anyone else to hear. She started with the basics, checking fluid levels and looking for obvious problems. The oil was clean, the coolant was full, and all the belts looked good. She examined the battery connections, the spark plug wires, and the air filter. Everything looked perfect. Maya heard Tommy Johnson talking to someone behind her. "She's doing all the same checks we did. Kid's got good fundamentals, I'll give her that, but she's not going to find anything we missed." Instead of getting frustrated, Maya took that as a challenge. If everyone else had done the same basic checks, then the problem had to be something different. Something that wouldn't show up in a standard diagnostic routine. She knelt down next to the engine and placed her ear close to different components, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. The crowd grew quieter, probably wondering what she was doing. Maya could hear Bill Cranston explaining to someone that she was just playing pretend and that real mechanics don't diagnose engines by listening to them. But Maya's father had taught her that every engine made its own unique sounds, and those sounds told a story. She listened to the alternator area, the water pump, the fuel lines. Everything sounded normal, which was part of the problem. If the engine wasn't making any unusual noises, then the issue might be something that only happened when the engine was actually trying to run. Maya stood up and walked around to the driver's side of the car. She slid into the seat, which still smelled faintly of the aftershave Mr. Chun must have worn. The interior was as pristine as the engine bay. Clearly, this had been a man who treasured his car. She turned the key to the on position without trying to start the engine. The dashboard lights came on normally. The fuel gauge showed half a tank. Everything looked exactly like it should. Maya turned the key further and tried to start the engine. It cranked over strongly. The battery was good and the starter was working fine. But the engine didn't catch, didn't even cough or sputter. It just turned over and over without any sign of life. She tried again, listening carefully to the sound. The engine was cranking at the right speed, which meant the timing chain wasn't broken. But something was definitely missing. Maya sat in the driver's seat for a moment, thinking about what she'd learned. 15 minutes left. Pete called out. Maya got out of the car and walked back to the engine bay. She was aware that people were starting to look impatient. Some of the other mechanics were shaking their heads, probably thinking she was wasting everyone's time. But Maya had an idea. She'd been thinking about this car for weeks, reading about 1967 Mustangs and their common problems. One thing she'd learned was that Mr. Chun's generation of car owners sometimes made modifications that weren't obvious to modern mechanics. They might install aftermarket parts or create custom solutions that looked like original equipment. Maya started examining the engine more carefully, looking for anything that seemed slightly different from the factory specifications. She traced fuel lines, checked electrical connections, and examined every component for signs that it might have been modified or replaced. Near the back of the engine, she found something interesting. There was a small valve that looked like it belonged there, but something about it seemed slightly different from the rest of the engine. The metal was a slightly different color, and the mounting looked newer than the surrounding components. Maya called her father over. "Dad, does this look original to you?" Carlos examined the valve closely. "It looks right, but maybe not. Hard to tell without checking the factory specs." 10 minutes left. Pete announced that Maya was running out of time for her examination period, but she had a growing suspicion about that valve. She'd read about aftermarket anti-theft devices that were popular in the 1960s and 70s. Some car owners installed hidden fuel shutoffs or ignition switches to prevent theft. To a casual observer, these devices looked like original equipment. She examined the valve more closely and noticed something that made her heart race. There were tiny scratches around the valve head, like someone had been turning it with a wrench. And the position of the valve looked like it might be partially closed. Maya spent her last few minutes examining the fuel system around that valve. If it was some kind of shutoff, and if it was partially closed, it would explain why the engine wasn't getting fuel. But it would also explain why previous mechanics had missed it. They would have assumed it was a factory component and not checked to see if it was actually functioning. "Time's up for examination," Pete called out. "Maya Rodriguez, you now have 2 hours to attempt your repair." Maya looked at her father, who had been watching her work with growing interest. "What do you think, Mia? You got an idea?" Maya nodded, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. "I think I might know what's wrong, Dad, but I need to check one more thing first." She walked over to where Mrs. Chun was sitting on a folding chair, looking tired but hopeful. Maya knelt down next to the elderly woman and spoke quietly. "Mrs. Chun, can I ask you something about your husband? Did he ever mention anything about protecting the car from thieves? Maybe something he installed to keep people from stealing it?" Mrs. Chun's eyes widened slightly. "Oh my, I'd forgotten about that. Yes, he did install something years ago. He was so proud of it. Said it was his secret way of making sure nobody could steal his baby." Maya felt a surge of excitement. "Do you remember what it was?" "Not really, dear. He showed me once, but I never paid much attention to mechanical things. I just knew that sometimes he had to do something special before the car would start." Maya thanked Mrs. Chun and walked back to the engine bay. The crowd was getting larger now. Word had spread that the teenage girl was actually attempting a repair, and people were curious to see what would happen. Maya looked at the mysterious valve one more time. If her theory was right, this wasn't just a fuel line component. It was a hidden shutoff valve that Mr. Chun had installed to prevent theft. Over the years, vibration and age had probably caused it to slowly close, gradually starving the engine of fuel until it finally stopped running altogether. Every mechanic who had worked on the car would have assumed the valve was original equipment. They would have checked for fuel pressure at the engine, but they wouldn't have checked to see if fuel was actually flowing through this particular valve. Maya selected a wrench from her father's toolbox and approached the valve. The crowd grew quiet, sensing that something important was about to happen. If she was right, the solution to the impossible puzzle was about to be incredibly simple. If she was wrong, she was about to embarrass herself in front of hundreds of people. Maya took a deep breath and placed the wrench on the valve head. It was time to find out if 15 years of learning from her father had prepared her for this moment. Maya placed the wrench on the valve head and felt it give slightly under pressure. Her heart started pounding as she realized the valve wasn't frozen in place. It could still be turned. She applied gentle pressure, turning it counterclockwise, and felt it move freely. The crowd had grown completely silent. Even the children had stopped talking, sensing that something important was happening. Maya could feel hundreds of eyes watching her every movement as she carefully turned the valve. 1/4 turn, half a turn, 3/4. Suddenly, she heard a faint hissing sound, the sound of fuel beginning to flow through lines that had been starved for months. Maya's hands were trembling now, but not from nervousness. She was trembling from excitement. "Dad," she whispered to Carlos, who was standing right beside her, "I think this is it." Carlos leaned in close and heard the sound too. His eyes widened as he realized what his daughter had discovered. "Mia, you might have just solved the impossible puzzle." Maya finished turning the valve until it was completely open, then carefully tightened it in that position. The hissing sound continued for a few more seconds before stopping. The fuel lines were filling up for the first time in months. She walked around to the driver's side of the Mustang, aware that every person in the crowd was following her movements. Some people had climbed onto cars and trucks to get a better view. Maya could see Bill Cranston standing near the front of the crowd, his arms crossed and his expression skeptical. Maya slid into the driver's seat and took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. Either her theory was correct and the car would start, or she was wrong and nothing would happen. There was no middle ground. She turned the key to the on position and waited a moment for the fuel pump to prime the system. Then she turned the key further and held her breath. The engine cranked once, twice, 3 times. Maya was starting to worry that she'd been wrong after all. But on the 4th revolution, something magical happened. The engine coughed. Just once, but it was definitely the sound of combustion trying to happen. Maya's heart leaped as she realized fuel was finally reaching the cylinders. She tried again, and this time the engine coughed twice before settling back into the familiar sound of cranking without catching. Maya knew she was close now. The car wanted to start, it just needed a little more help. On her 3rd attempt, the engine caught and ran for about 2 seconds before dying again. But those 2 seconds were enough to send a murmur of excitement through the crowd. People were starting to realize that something was actually happening. Maya tried a 4th time, and the engine caught and held for almost 5 seconds before stalling. She was getting closer. The fuel was flowing now, but the engine needed time to clear out months of stale fuel and get fresh gas into all the right places. Tommy Johnson was standing about 20 feet away, and Maya heard him say to someone, "I'll be damned. I think she's actually got it figured out." On Maya's 5th attempt, the engine roared to life with a sound that made the entire crowd gasp. The deep, throaty rumble of a V8 engine that had been sleeping for too long filled the air. But Maya knew she wasn't done yet. She had to keep it running for 5 full minutes to officially win the challenge. She gently pressed the gas pedal, bringing the engine up to a steady idle. The sound was absolutely beautiful, smooth and powerful, exactly like a well-maintained classic Mustang should sound. Maya could hardly believe what she was hearing. The crowd erupted. People were cheering, clapping, and whistling. Some were jumping up and down with excitement. Maya could see her father standing near the front of the crowd with tears in his eyes and the biggest smile she'd ever seen on his face. But the most important reaction came from Mrs. Chun. The elderly woman had been helped to her feet by 2 people standing nearby, and she was crying as she listened to her husband's car running again. Maya could see her lips moving, probably saying something to her late husband that only she could hear. Maya kept the engine running at a steady idle, watching the clock that Pete Williams was holding up so everyone could see. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The engine was running perfectly now, all the cylinders firing smoothly and the exhaust note steady and strong. At the 3-minute mark, Maya tried revving the engine slightly. It responded immediately, the RPMs climbing smoothly without any hesitation or missing. Whatever problem had kept this car silent for months was completely gone now. Bill Cranston had pushed his way through the crowd and was standing right next to the car, staring at the engine in disbelief. Maya could see him shaking his head, probably trying to figure out how a 15-year-old girl had solved a problem that had stumped so many experienced mechanics. 4 minutes. The crowd was getting more excited as they realized Maya was actually going to win. Someone started chanting, "Maya! Maya!" And soon half the crowd had joined in. Maya felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment and pride at the same time. At 4.5 minutes, Maya noticed Mrs. Chun walking slowly toward the car. The elderly woman's face was streaked with tears, but she was smiling the biggest smile Maya had ever seen. When she reached the driver's side window, Mrs. Chun placed her hand on Maya's shoulder. "Thank you," Mrs. Chun whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "You brought my husband's car back to life. You brought part of him back to me." Maya felt her own eyes filling with tears. This wasn't about winning a competition anymore. This wasn't about proving herself to people who didn't believe in her. This was about helping someone who had lost something precious and thought it was gone forever. 5 minutes, Pete Williams announced, and the crowd went absolutely wild. Maya turned off the engine, and the sudden silence felt strange after the beautiful rumble of the V8. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then she got out of the car and was immediately surrounded by people congratulating her. Her father reached her first, wrapping her in a bear hug that lifted her off her feet. "I'm so proud of you, Mia," he whispered in her ear. "You did something amazing today." Tommy Johnson was one of the first mechanics to approach her. "Maya, I owe you an apology," he said, extending his hand. "That was brilliant detective work. I never would have thought to check that valve." Even Bill Cranston eventually made his way over to congratulate her, though Maya could tell it was hard for him to admit he'd been wrong. "You surprised me today, kid," he said gruffly. "That was good work." Pete Williams pushed through the crowd with a check for $5,000 and a trophy that was almost as tall as Maya. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced through his megaphone, "we have our winner. Maya Rodriguez has solved the impossible puzzle." But Maya barely heard the announcement. She was watching Mrs. Chun, who was sitting in the driver's seat of her husband's Mustang with her hands on the steering wheel and her eyes closed. The elderly woman looked more peaceful than she had all day. Later, as the crowd was dispersing and Maya was loading her father's tools back into their truck, Mrs. Chun approached her one more time. "Maya dear, I want you to have something," Mrs. Chun said, holding out a small key ring. "These are the original keys to the Mustang. My husband would have wanted you to have them." Maya started to protest, but Mrs. Chun insisted. "You didn't just fix a car today, sweetheart. You gave me back a piece of my heart that I thought was lost forever. My husband would have been so proud of you." As Maya and her father drove home that evening, the trophy sitting between them on the truck seat, Carlos reached over and squeezed his daughter's hand. "You know what the best part of today was?" he asked. "What's that, Dad?" "Watching you prove to yourself what I've always known. That you're not just the mechanic's daughter. You're a mechanic, a really good one." Maya smiled and looked out the window at the darkening sky. Tomorrow, she'd probably be back in her father's garage, working on everyday cars with everyday problems. But today, she'd shown everyone, including herself, that sometimes the impossible is just waiting for someone who knows how to listen. The Mustang's keys felt warm in her pocket, a reminder that some victories are worth more than any prize money could ever be.